The nurse handed me the folder with both hands, the way you hand someone something breakable. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, "I need you to sit down before you open this." I didn't sit down. I opened it, standing in the hallway of St. Osmond's Medical Center at 11 minutes past midnight, my reading glasses still crooked on my face from where I'd shoved them on in the car. 46. That was the number circled in red ink at the top of the intake summary. 46 documented injuries, some fresh, some 8 months old. My legs went first. Not dramatically, I didn't collapse, but something in my knees simply stopped agreeing to hold weight, and I had to put my hand flat against the cold cinder block wall to stay upright. Ren was 19 feet down that corridor, behind a door with a small reinforced window, and the girl I had raised since she was 7 years old, the girl who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat of my truck, with a book still open on her lap, was lying in a bed wired to machines because of a man I had walked her down the aisle to marry. When I asked the detective standing near the vending machines how long this had been going on, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked instead at his coffee, and he said the words that would not leave me for the rest of my life. "Mr. Ashworth, I'd be lying if I said we could touch that family. The Vosses own this county. They always have. Untouchable." That was the word he used. And something in my chest went very quiet and very cold, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm changes direction. Before I go further, I want to say clearly, this story weaves fictional elements into a narrative built for emotional truth rather than documentary fact. The names, the county, the people in it, none of them are drawn from a specific real case. But the pattern underneath it, the silence, the power that protects the wrong people, that part, I suspect, many of you will recognize immediately. 3 hours earlier, I had been sitting at my kitchen table the way I sit most evenings, with 2 mugs in front of me even though only one of them ever gets used. Mina had been gone 6 years, and I still couldn't bring myself to make just 1 cup of coffee in the morning. Some habits aren't really habits. They're just love with nowhere left to go. I'm 62 years old. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant for the state, which meant I spent 31 years in rooms where people lied to me with numbers, thinking numbers couldn't talk back. They always could. I was good at listening to what a column of figures wasn't saying out loud. I was considerably less good, it turned out, at listening to what my own stepdaughter wasn't saying out loud, either because for 2 years, every time I asked Ren how married life was treating her, she smiled the exact smile her mother used to give me when she didn't want me to worry, and I let that smile be enough. I told myself a father's unease around a son-in-law is just an old man's jealousy. I told myself a lot of things. The phone had rung at 8:52. Callan's name on the screen. His voice was flat when I answered, not shaken, not panicked, flat like a man reading from a card he'd rehearsed. "Ren had an accident. You should come to St. Osmond's." He hung up before I could ask what kind. I remember almost nothing about the drive except the windshield wipers and a single thought looping over and over. She fell down the stairs once when she was 11 and broke her wrist and cried the whole way to the hospital because she thought I'd be angry about her bike. I was never angry. I don't think I've ever once in my life been angry at that girl. Not until tonight when I stood in a hospital corridor holding a folder with the word 46 circled in red and felt something old and buried and completely unfamiliar rise up in me like floodwater finding a crack in a foundation. I am not a violent man. I want you to understand that from the beginning, because what I'm about to tell you over the next several hours is not a story about a man with a gun. It's a story about a man with 31 years of knowing exactly how to make numbers confess. And on that night, standing in that hallway, I made myself a promise I intended to keep with everything I had left in me. If the law wouldn't touch the Voss family, I would find the one thing that could. If you're ready to walk through this with me, every discovery, every buried report, every quiet, dangerous move it took to bring an untouchable family to its knees, then let's begin. Drop a comment and tell me what part of the world you're watching from tonight. I read every single one of them, and it means more than you know to hear where this story is landing. Hit that like button, subscribe to Dorian's Revenge Stories, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter of what's coming. Because what I found in that hospital folder was only the very beginning. The doctor who came to find me had a name I would not forget. Dr. Perpetua Ondera, a compact woman with steady hands and the particular stillness of someone who delivers devastating news for a living and has learned that stillness is its own kind of mercy. She didn't waste time on preamble. She led me to a small consultation room, closed the door, and set a series of imaging films against the light box on the wall, one after another, like a woman laying down cards in a game she already knew the ending to. "These are her ribs," she said, pointing to a pale hairline shadow. "Healed, approximately 5 months old." She moved to the next film. "This is her left wrist, also healed, roughly 7 months." A third film went up, and her voice changed, not louder, but harder, the way stone sounds different than wood when you knock on it. "This is fresh, within the last 48 hours. I asked her the only question I had left in me. "How many?" "46, she said again, and this time she didn't look away from me when she said it. "Mr. Ashworth, I have practiced medicine for 19 years. This is not a woman who fell downstairs. This is a documented pattern of deliberate, repeated harm." She reached into a folder and drew out photographs, close, clinical, printed on the flat, glossy paper hospitals use for evidence, not comfort. Small, circular burns along the inside of Ren's forearm, evenly spaced, patient in a way that made my stomach turn over completely. Not the chaos of an accident, the discipline of someone who had done this many times and had never once been in a hurry. "Who brought her in?" I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer before it left my mouth. "Her husband," Dr. Ondera said. "He told the intake nurse she fell down the basement stairs." I sat with that sentence the way you sit with a stone in your shoe, unable to walk properly until you deal with it, unwilling to stop long enough to. I thought about my late wife, Mina, and the way she used to say that grief and rage come from the same well. They just wear different coats. I understood, standing in that small room under fluorescent light, exactly what she meant. "Let me ask you something, and I genuinely want to know. If you found out someone you loved had been silently enduring this for months while smiling at you every single Sunday dinner, would you have seen it? Or would you, like me, have told yourself it was just an old habit of worry, nothing more?" Type your answer below. I read every one, and honestly, some nights, your comments are the only thing that gets me through writing these down. Dr. Ondera walked me through the rest slowly, methodically, the way you'd want a surgeon to work rather than a storyteller to talk. She told me she was legally required to file a report with Adult Protective Services and that she already had. Then she paused, glanced at the closed door behind her, and lowered her voice to something just above breath. "Mr. Ashworth, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without reacting where anyone can see you." I waited. "There have been reports before." I pulled her chart history before you arrived. 2 prior emergency visits in the last 14 months. Both logged as accidental. Both closed without follow-up. She looked at me directly. "I don't know why, but I have a guess, and I think you already have the same one. The Voss name." Callan's father, Godric Voss, had sat on the county commission for 11 years. He owned half the industrial parkland in 3 townships. He had, according to the detective I would speak to 20 minutes later in that same hallway, judges at his dinner table, and deputies on his private payroll disguised as security consulting. I want you to sit with that for a moment the way I had to. A grown woman had walked into an emergency room twice before tonight, with injuries that told a story no one wanted to read, and both times, the file was closed like a drawer nobody wanted to open again. The detective's name was Osric Fenwick Heavyset, tired around the eyes in the specific way of a man who has spent decades watching a system fail people and has run out of ways to feel surprised by it. He found me by the vending machines, coffee in hand, and he told me plainly that if I pushed loudly, publicly, angrily, I would hand the Voss family exactly the story they needed: unstable father, grieving widower, unreliable narrator. "They've buried louder men than you," he said. "Quietly is the only way this works." I told him quiet was, in fact, my entire profession. 31 years of quiet, 31 years of finding the one number in 10,000 that didn't belong, and waiting, patient as frost, until the whole structure it was hiding inside finally cracked open on its own. I went back to Ren's room before I left that night. I sat beside her bed and held her hand, careful of the tape and the bruising, and I talked to her the way you talk to someone who can't hear you yet, but might feel that you're there. I told her I was sorry. I told her that whatever it took, however long it took, I was going to make this right, not with my fists, because that's not who her mother raised me to become, but with the only weapon I've ever truly known how to use: the truth, followed all the way to its source. If this story has grabbed you the way it grabbed me writing it down, do me one favor before we go further, hit like on this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet strength can still win. It genuinely helps this story reach the people who need it most. Now let's go back to that hallway, because what Detective Fenwick told me next changed absolutely everything about how I was going to fight this family. Detective Fenwick led me out through a side exit near the ambulance bay, away from the waiting room windows, and lit a cigarette he didn't offer me, though I noticed his hand wasn't quite steady doing it. "I'm going to tell you something I probably shouldn't," he said, "and then I'm going to ask you not to do anything that gets us both fired or worse." I told him I'd spent my career being the most boring man in any room. He almost smiled at that. Almost. "2 prior reports," he said. 14 months ago, an ER visit logged as a fall. 6 months ago, a wellness check requested by a neighbor, closed same day, no follow-up documented. He exhaled smoke into the cold air. Both times the file crossed a desk in records, and both times somebody above my pay grade made a call and it just stopped moving. "I can't prove who. I have a very strong guess." "Godric Voss," I said. It wasn't a question. "He's chaired the county commission for 11 years. He controls appointments to 3 judgeships indirectly through campaign finance. Half the department's overtime budget runs through a private security contract with a company his family owns." Fenwick looked at me, and something in his face had the particular exhaustion of a man who has made peace with his own failure and hates the taste of it every single day. "If you go in loud, Mr. Ashworth, they will bury you exactly the way they buried those reports. Grieving father, unstable, harassing a respected local family. That story writes itself in this county. It's already got a pen." I asked him why he was telling me any of this at all, since it clearly wasn't required of him. He looked back toward the hospital doors, toward the window where, somewhere behind glass and gauze, my stepdaughter lay wired to a monitor counting her heartbeat in soft green light. "Because 4 reports is going to become 5, he said quietly. "And I don't want to be the man who watches the 6th one be the one that kills her." I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the same case file discipline I'd used for 3 decades auditing state contracts, except this time the ledger in front of me was blank, and the fraud I was chasing wasn't hidden in a spreadsheet. It was hidden in a marriage, in a family name, in a county that had learned to look away on command. I want to ask you something here, because I've thought about this a great deal since that night. When the system that's supposed to protect the people we love simply refuses to, not because it can't, but because it's been paid not to, what do? Do you walk away and grieve quietly, the way so many families before mine apparently had to? Or do you become something the system never planned for? I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments, because the choice I made that night is the entire reason you're watching this story unfold right now. By morning, I had a single word written at the top of a fresh legal pad. Voss. Beneath it, in the same small, deliberate handwriting I'd used to flag 31 years of fraudulent expense reports and skimmed public funds, I began to build what would become the most important audit of my life. I started, the way I always start, with public record, campaign finance disclosures, county contract awards, property deeds, none of it hidden, none of it illegal to request. All of it sitting in plain sight in filing cabinets and databases that almost nobody ever bothers to actually read. That's the strange secret of corruption in small counties. It isn't hidden nearly as well as people assume, because the people running it have never once been made to believe anyone would look. By the 3rd page of notes, I found the first thread worth pulling: a construction company called Ashgrove Contracting, which had won 14 of the last 16 county infrastructure bids over 3 years. Every single one of them approved under a signature I recognized instantly, because I'd watched that same hand sign my daughter's wedding certificate 2 years earlier. Colin Voss. I sat back in my chair and looked at that signature for a long, long time. My late wife used to tell me, back when I came home furious about a county treasurer skimming funds early in my career, that you don't fight fires with your fists, you find where they started. I had built an entire career on that sentence. And sitting there at dawn, legal pad in front of me, cold coffee beside a mug that had gone untouched for 6 years, I understood I was about to build the most important case of my career on it too. I picked up the phone and called an old colleague I hadn't spoken to in almost 4 years, a man named Percival Ensah, who had spent 2 decades in federal financial crimes investigation, before retiring to a quiet life of fishing and, apparently, still answering his phone on the second ring, no matter what hour it rang. "Dorian," he said before I'd even spoken, "it's been a long time. What's wrong?" I told him everything. The 46 injuries, the buried reports, the detective who was scared enough to whisper the truth to me in a parking lot. Percival listened the way he always had, completely silent, letting a man finish his own thought before offering one of his own. When I finished, there was a pause on the line long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "Send me what you have," he finally said. "And Dorian, if this family is even half of what you're describing, you're going to need more than a legal pad. You're going to need a federal case." I looked out my kitchen window at the gray edge of morning coming up over the oak tree Mina had planted the year we bought this house. And for the first time since that phone call at 8:52 the night before, something in my chest loosened by exactly 1 degree. If you're finding yourself invested in this the way I hope you are, do me a kindness, leave a comment telling me who in your life taught you that patience and quiet strength can be sharper than rage, because that's exactly the lesson that carried me through what came next. And if this story is holding you the way I think it might be, go ahead and subscribe now, because Chapter 4 is where the real evidence starts coming together, and where I met the young woman who had been waiting 14 months for someone to finally ask her the right question. Before I continue this story, quick one for women over 40. If you've been struggling with stress, poor sleep, headaches, or constant tiredness, please don't ignore it. These can be early signs your body is under pressure, and over time it can affect your heart and blood pressure. That's exactly why I created a simple 21-day reset guide to help you sleep better, reduce stress, and support healthy blood pressure naturally. Check my bio and tap the link now. I won't be leaving it up for long. Now back to the story. Her name was Adeline Reyes Varga, and I found her the way I found most things in those early days, by being systematic about a man who had never expected anyone to be. Ashgrove Contracting's public bid filings listed a former project compliance officer who had left the company 14 months earlier under what the filing dryly called voluntary separation. It took 2 phone calls and 1 afternoon at the county records office to learn that voluntary was, in this case, a polite legal fiction. I met her at a coffee shop on the edge of town, far enough from the courthouse square that nobody wearing a tie would recognize either of us. She was younger than I expected, maybe 29, with the particular wariness of someone who has learned the hard way that trust is a currency you don't spend twice on the same kind of person. "You're Ren's father," she said, before I'd even sat down. Not a question. "Stepfather," I said. But yes, something in her shoulders dropped half an inch, like a door easing off a lock it had been holding shut for a long time. "I've been waiting 14 months for someone to ask me the right questions," she said. I was starting to think no one ever would. She told me she'd worked compliance for Ashgrove Contracting for just over 2 years, reviewing bid documentation before it went to the county for approval. 6 months before she was let go, she noticed something that any auditor worth his salary would have flagged in an instant: competing bids on public infrastructure contracts submitted within the same narrow window of time by companies that, on paper, had nothing to do with each other. "I pulled the business registrations," she said, opening a laptop between us with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who had rehearsed this moment more times than she wanted to admit. 3 different companies, 3 different names, 1 registered agent. She turned the screen toward me. "A man named Thaddeus Okoro. He shows up on all 3. I felt something settle into place in my chest, the particular quiet click of a number finally confessing what it had been hiding. 14 contracts. Ashgrove had won all 14. Every single one signed off by Callan Voss. "When I flagged it," she continued, "Callan called me into his office and told me I'd misread the data. I hadn't. I have a master's degree and 4 years of compliance experience, and I know exactly what a rigged bid looks like when it's sitting in front of me." Her jaw tightened, and for a moment the wariness dropped away entirely, replaced by something harder and cleaner, the kind of anger that comes from being told you imagined the thing you know you saw. "He fired me the next morning. Told 3 other firms in the county I'd falsified reports. I haven't worked in my field since." I asked her the only question that mattered. Did she have proof? For the first time since I'd sat down, something close to a smile crossed her face. Thin, grim, entirely earned. She reached into her bag and set a small external drive on the table between us. Everything I saved before they walked me out. All obtained during my normal employment. Legally. Nothing he can touch. She pushed it an inch closer to me. I've been sitting on this for 14 months, waiting for someone who'd actually know what to do with it. I picked it up and held it the way you hold something that has already cost a great deal to keep safe. Miss Reyes Varga, I said, I spent 31 years as a state auditor. I know precisely what to do with it. Here's a question I want you to sit with, the way I had to sit with it that afternoon in that coffee shop. How many people like Adeline are out there right now, holding evidence of something wrong, just waiting for someone to finally ask them the right question? If you've ever been that person, the one who saw something and wasn't believed, I want you to tell me about it in the comments below. Your story matters, and I promise you, I read every single one. We spent the next 3 days at my kitchen table, spreading county contract records across the same surface where Mina used to grade her 4th grade spelling tests. Adeline moved through spreadsheets the way I moved through case files, not reading numbers so much as listening for the one note that didn't belong. By the second afternoon, she'd cross-referenced 11 of the 14 Ashgrove contracts and found something that made her go very still. Dorian, she corrected herself. Look at the submission timestamps on the competing bids. 11 of 14 came in within the same 40-minute window. Same day. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens when someone tells 3 shell companies to lose on command. I underlined the name Thaddeus Okoro on my legal pad, the same slow, deliberate motion I'd used 10,000 times across 3 decades of audit work. Not angry, just marking something that needed to be looked at far more closely. What none of us knew yet, what I wouldn't learn for another 11 days, was that Thaddeus Okoro's name wasn't just tied to a construction company. It was about to lead us somewhere far darker, into a financial trail that would eventually connect this small county bid rigging scheme to something even Detective Fenwick's quiet warnings hadn't prepared me for. If this story has you leaning forward the way I was leaning forward over that kitchen table, I need you to do one thing for me before we go further. Hit that like button right now, because it genuinely helps more people find this story. And there are people out there right now living through exactly what Ren lived through, who need to know that someone eventually stood up for her. Subscribe if you haven't already, because Chapter 5 is where we find the connection that turns this from a local corruption case into something federal agents will call, in their own words, impossible to ignore. Dr. Ondra called me on a Thursday morning, and I knew from the particular quality of her silence before she spoke that something had shifted. I need to tell you something in person, she said. Not on this line. I met her in the same small consultation room where she'd first shown me those imaging films. And this time she looked different. The clinical stillness was still there. But underneath it was something tighter, something frightened. She checked the hallway twice before closing the door. 3 days after I filed the Protective Services report, she said, I received a call from hospital administration. Someone had filed a complaint against my medical license. Anonymous. Alleged clinical negligence. Her hands, folded on the desk in front of her, were trembling almost imperceptibly. I have practiced medicine for 19 years, Dorian. I have never once had a complaint filed against me. I asked her, though I already suspected the answer, who she thought was behind it. I can't prove it, she said. But I know it the way you know certain things in this county, not because anyone tells you outright, but because you understand exactly how the machine works. She took a slow breath. I was told, not asked, that if I amended Ren's chart, reclassified the injuries as consistent with an accidental fall, rather than a pattern of abuse, the complaint would quietly disappear. My jaw tightened until I felt the pressure of it behind my ear. Did you amend it? Yes, she said, and the word visibly cost her something. I had no choice that my license could survive. But before I made a single change, I filed a full, unedited report directly with the state medical board through their confidential channel, completely outside this hospital's system, completely outside anything the Voss family can reach. She reached into her desk and slid a folded printout toward me. In the amended file, the one I was forced to alter, I made sure the digital modification log stayed intact. Every change to an electronic medical record is time-stamped and tied to a device ID. I looked down at the printout. An IP address, a workstation identifier, neither belonging to any device inside the hospital's own network. The request to alter Ren's file, Dr. Ondra said quietly, originated from a computer registered to the office of County Commissioner Godric Voss. The room went very still around me, not the stillness of nothing happening, but the particular stillness of something enormous, finally locking into place. I had spent 3 decades reading numbers that lied for a living. I had never once seen a lie confess itself quite this cleanly. I want to ask you honestly, if you discovered that the very people meant to protect someone you love had been quietly pressured into silence, would you have known where to even begin looking for proof? Because I didn't, not really, not until that moment. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to fight a system that seemed built to protect everyone except the person who needed it most. I read every single story you share with me. I called Percival that same evening. He'd been quietly working through the financial documents Autoline had given us, cross-referencing Ashgrove Contracting's shell company network against public tax filings. And when he picked up, there was a new tension in his voice I hadn't heard in the 30 years I'd known him. "Dorian," he said, "I found something, and I want you sitting down for it." He explained that Thaddeus Okoro, the registered agent tied to all 3 shell bidding companies, also appeared as a signatory on a nonprofit foundation's financial disclosures. A foundation, Percival said carefully, that had received a single donation 8 months earlier for $210,000, routed through a Delaware-registered trust called Kestrel Point Holdings. "Dorian," he said again, "the foundation is called the Mina Ashworth Legacy Fund." I did not say anything for a long moment. I could not. Mina had spent the last 3 years of her life building that scholarship fund for rural elementary teachers, raising it dollar by dollar, bake sale by bake sale, until she'd gathered just under $50,000 before the cancer took the rest of her strength. It was the last good thing she built with her own 2 hands. And someone, some faceless network tied to the family that had put my stepdaughter in a hospital bed, had used her name, her memory, her legacy, to launder $210,000 of dirty money. "They used her," I said, and my voice came out flat and strange, the voice of a man standing at the very edge of something he did not know he was capable of feeling. "Arthur Dorian," Percival corrected himself gently, the way people did now when the old auditor's habits slipped back into old names. "This is the piece that changes everything. The moment that money touched a registered nonprofit, this stopped being a county corruption case. This becomes federal, DOJ, FBI financial crimes, possibly DEA if that trust connects to what I think it connects to." A pause. "But Dorian, are you ready for what happens once that door opens? Because once it opens, it does not close again until it's finished." I looked at the photograph on my windowsill, Mina laughing at something off camera. Her hair caught sideways in an April wind, the same spring she'd planted the oak tree in our backyard. "They used her name," I said quietly, "to move money for the same family that hurt my daughter. That is going to be the last mistake they ever make. If this part of the story hit you the way it hit me, writing it down, I need you to share this video with one person right now, someone who needs to hear that even grief, even loss, can become the thing that finally brings the guilty to their knees. It matters more than you know. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Dorian's Revenge Stories, because Chapter 6 is where the federal case begins to move and where the Voss family makes their first fatal mistake. Percival drove down from his lake house the following morning, and we spent 2 full days at my kitchen table building what he called, with the flat precision of a man who had spent 20 years doing exactly this, a package that arrives clean. I organized the evidence the way I'd organized 31 years of audits methodically, in layers, each one supporting the next. The rigged Ashgrove contracts, Autoline's saved documentation, Dr. Ondera's modification log, tracing straight back to a government workstation, the wire transfer into the Mina Ashworth Legacy Fund. "There's one more piece we need," Percival said on the second evening, tapping his pen against a blank line on his own notepad. "Everything we have is documents. Documents can be argued with, reframed, blamed on someone else down the chain. What we don't have yet is a voice, something from inside that house, something the Voss family generated themselves in a moment they thought no one was listening." I thought about something Wren had mentioned to me months before any of this began. A passing comment I'd filed away without understanding why. A woman who worked in the Voss household, Perpetua, she'd called her, though I would soon learn her name was actually Solveig Marsh, a quiet groundskeeper's wife who'd cleaned for the family for 6 years. Wren had said, almost as an afterthought during a Sunday call, Dad, I think she's scared too. Percival found her within 2 days. The way Percival found everyone carefully, patiently, through people who owed him old favors from a career built on exactly this kind of patient unraveling. He met her at a diner outside the county line, and when he called me that night, his voice had the particular steadiness of a man who has just heard something that changes the entire shape of a case. She's been recording, he said, for months. Her daughter showed her how to use the voice memo app on her phone last year and told her, Mama, if anyone ever scares you, you press this button. She's pressed it dozens of times. Solveig came to my house 2 days later, sitting at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea, looking at me with the exhausted directness of a woman who was finally done being afraid. The first time Godric Voss raised his voice at me, she said, I dropped an entire tray of dishes. That was 6 years ago. I learned very quickly in that house you do not make noise, you do not ask questions, and you do not let them see you looking. She reached into her coat and set an old, cracked screen phone on the table between us. But I kept my phone in my pocket every single time. There were 31 audio files on that phone, spanning 14 months, each one labeled with a date in her own careful handwriting. I pressed play on the most recent, recorded the same week Wren had been admitted to St. Osmond's. The audio was muffled, the sound of a phone recording from inside a coat pocket, but the voices were unmistakable, a man's voice, older, accustomed to being obeyed, speaking through a phone speaker. Handle it tonight, Callan. I've already spoken to the department. Nobody's going to be asking questions we don't want asked. Do you understand me? In Callan's voice, flat, compliant, the voice of a man who had stopped making his own decisions a very long time ago. I understand. I sat very still at my own kitchen table with a stranger's cracked phone in my trembling hands, and I thought about Detective Fenwick standing by the vending machines, telling me the Voss family had judges at their dinner table. I thought about 2 prior emergency room visits, quietly closed. I thought about Dr. Ondera's shaking hands and Adeline's 14 months of unemployment, and Mina's scholarship fund, hijacked to launder money for the very people who had done this to her daughter. I want to ask you something, and I mean this sincerely. Have you ever had a moment where a single piece of evidence, a single sentence, made every scattered, confusing piece of a situation suddenly click into perfect, horrifying focus? That was this moment for me. Tell me about yours in the comments below, because I promise you, sharing it helps someone else recognize the same pattern in their own life before it's too late. Percival called Dana Okonkwo Reyes at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in the state capitol. That same night, a woman he'd worked alongside for nearly a decade before his retirement, and someone he trusted completely. He explained that what we had wasn't a county corruption matter anymore. It was, in his words, a fully documented racketeering and money laundering structure, with an audio recording of a command to obstruct an active domestic violence investigation. There was a long pause on the line. Then Agent Okonkwo Reyes said the words that Percival repeated to me almost exactly as she'd spoken them, because he understood I would need to hear them precisely. If everything you're describing holds up, she said, this isn't a local case anymore, Percival. This is a federal RICO investigation. Get me everything you have by Monday. I looked at the legal pad in front of me, 14 pages now, filled with names, dates, dollar amounts, a signature I'd traced back through 14 rig contracts, a modification log that led straight to a commissioner's office, and a recording that would end whatever argument the Voss family thought they still had left to make. If you're still with me, drop a comment right now telling me you're in this until the very end. Because what happens next, the 2 men who followed me through a grocery store, the phone call from Callan that tried to test how much I actually knew, is where this story stops being quiet. And the Voss family finally realizes exactly who they've been underestimating. The 2 men found me 3 days later, in the cereal aisle of the grocery store on Delacroix Avenue, of all the ordinary places in the world. I noticed them the way I'd learned to notice things across 3 decades of reading rooms that were designed not to be read, one near the end of the aisle, holding a box he clearly had no interest in, the other close behind me, close enough that I could hear him breathing. Both in their 40s, both dressed in the particular kind of casual clothing that isn't quite casual, the kind you wear when you want to look like you belong somewhere and don't. I kept pushing my cart. I did not speed up. I did not look at either of them directly. At the coffee display, the first man appeared beside me, broad-shouldered, a face that had once been handsome and had since gone merely large. He picked up a bag of coffee, turned it over in his hands with theatrical calm, and said in a voice that was pleasant and very quiet, "Mr. Ashworth, Commissioner Voss wanted you to know he thinks very highly of you. Hopes you're taking good care of yourself." He set the bag back on the shelf, straightened it with unnecessary care, and walked away without looking back. I stood there with my hands on the cart handle and felt my heart slamming against my ribs like something trying to escape. But I did not move, because a frightened man is a readable man, and I was not going to be readable in a grocery store where anyone at all might be watching. Callan called that evening. His voice was warm, the practiced warmth of a man who has learned to deploy kindness the way other men deploy tools. "Dorian, I've been thinking about you. I know things have been difficult." A pause, calibrated, testing. "I think there's been some confusion about what happened to Wren. She's always been a bit accident-prone. You know that better than anyone. I'm worried some of the people at that hospital have been putting ideas in her head that aren't helpful for her recovery." I let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to sit. "I appreciate you calling, Callan," I said. "Family is everything." Then I hung up before he could recalibrate, before he could take my temperature, the way he was so clearly trying to. He had called to find out how much I knew. I had given him nothing at all. "Can I ask you something honestly? Have you ever had to sit across from or on the phone with someone who had hurt someone you loved and had to smile, had to stay calm, had to give away absolutely nothing, all while every part of you wanted to scream the truth in their face?" That phone call was one of the hardest 4 minutes of my entire life. If you've ever had to do that, I want to hear how you got through it. Tell me in the comments. It might help someone else who's living through that exact moment right now. Percival called an hour later. "They're spooked," he said. "That's not bad news, Dorian. A spooked man makes mistakes." "Whitmore, sorry. Agent Okonkwo Reyes reviewed the preliminary package today. She says she needs 2 more things before she can move. Complete wire records tracing Kestrel Point Holdings to whatever account it's feeding, and something directly from inside the Voss operation." "We already have Solveig's recordings," I said. "We need more than one," Percival said. "We need the financial trail complete, beginning to end, with no gaps a defense attorney can drive a truck through." The package went out that Friday, 114 pages, sealed, hand-delivered by a courier Percival trusted completely, addressed simultaneously to Agent Okonkwo Reyes and the Department of Justice's Office of Inspector General in the Capitol, through an encrypted federal submission channel that bypassed every local hand the Voss family had ever touched. "It doesn't cross a single desk in this county," Percival told me as we watched the courier's car disappear down the street. "It arrives clean." 11 days later, my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. 3 words, no punctuation, no name attached. "Back away, Ashworth." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I set the phone face down on my kitchen table, picked up my legal pad, and wrote the date, the time, and a single line beneath it. "Threat received. They know the package is moving." I underlined it once, the same slow, deliberate stroke I'd used across 31 years of flagging numbers that didn't belong. Because scared men, in my experience, the men who send anonymous texts instead of making phone calls, who send strangers into grocery stores instead of showing up themselves. Scared men are the most readable men of all. Detective Fenwick called 2 days after that, his voice lower and rougher than I'd ever heard it. "There are 2 federal agents in this county right now who didn't go through our department first," he said. 19 years on this job, Dorian, and I have never once seen that happen without a courtesy call to the sheriff. Somebody made sure they couldn't be warned. "How's Wren?" he asked before I could answer. "Moving in the right direction," I told him. And I meant every word of it. Her neurological responses were returning slowly, the doctors said, like a house coming back online 1 circuit at a time after a long outage. There was a long pause on Fenwick's end. Then quietly, almost to himself, "Good. That's good." If you've made it this far into the story, I want you to do one thing before we move into what happens next. Subscribe to Dorian's Revenge Stories if you haven't already, because Chapter 8 is where the Voss family finally begins turning on each other, and where I learned that my stepdaughter had been silently building her own case against them the entire time she was fighting to wake up. The federal agents arrived at 6:15 on a gray Tuesday morning, and I was not there to see it. I want to be honest about that, the same way I've tried to be honest with you through every part of this story. After everything, the legal pads, the coffee shop meetings, the 2 days building a package, clean enough to bypass an entire corrupted county. I was sitting at my own kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me when Percival called and told me it was moving. Simultaneous entry, he said. The commissioner's office, Ash Grove Contracting's headquarters, the Voss residence. Dorian, it's happening right now. I drove down anyway. I'm still not sure I made a conscious decision to go. I simply found myself on the highway an hour later, hands steady on the wheel, needing to stand somewhere near the place where all of this had finally cracked open. I parked 2 blocks from the commissioner's office and watched from a street corner as agents in dark jackets carried bankers' boxes out through the front doors on hand trucks. Records that had spent over a decade protecting a family that had, in the end, protected nothing but itself. Detective Fenwick found me on that same corner. He looked terrible gray in the face, his jacket wrinkled from a night with no sleep in it. I owe Wren an apology, he said, his voice cracking on the word and staying cracked. 2 prior reports. I pulled them from the archive myself this morning because I needed to see them with my own eyes. She was right there every single time, and somebody above me made a call and the file got closed, and I told myself there was nothing I could do. I told him what I believed then and still believe now, that the night he pulled me into a hospital hallway and told me the truth about how the machine worked, knowing exactly what it might cost him, was the moment that mattered. Not enough on its own, but not nothing either. Within days, the collapse began exactly the way Percival had predicted it, with 3 people who had operated as a single-family unit for over a decade, reduced almost overnight to 3 individuals racing to blame each other before the walls finished coming down. Callan's attorney reached out to the Justice Department first, offering full cooperation on the contract fraud and the pressure campaign against Wren in exchange for reduced exposure. Beatrix, Callan's mother, and the quiet architect of the financial concealment, as it turned out, submitted her own counterproffer 4 hours later, handing over 9 years of saved communications proving her husband Godric had originated, approved, and directed every piece of the scheme. And Godric himself, the man who had once told a compact hospital room's silence with a single sentence, "They always have," walked into a federal negotiation room with a leather ledger he'd kept since 1987, 38 years of names, dates, and favors, offering it all up in exchange for immunity he never actually received. Each of them, in the end, feeding the machine the exact evidence needed to convict the other 2. Here's something I've thought about a great deal since that week. Corrupt families like the Voss family often look, from the outside, like a single, unshakable structure, one name, one wall of protection, impossible to move. But underneath, they're rarely loyal to anything except their own survival. The moment real consequences arrive, that structure doesn't bend. It shatters, and it shatters from the inside. Have you ever watched something like that happen? A group of people who seemed untouchable, turning on each other the second real pressure finally reached them? Tell me about it in the comments. I promise you, I read every single one, and it helps me know this story is landing the way I hope it is. But none of that, not the ledger, not the wire records, not even Solveig's recordings, was the piece that finally ended Godric Voss's attempt to argue his way to freedom. That came from Wren herself. I was in the hospital parking lot when Marcus Percival, forgive me, some names still slip when I'm telling this out loud, called to tell me the proffer wasn't holding, that Godric's attorneys were building an argument that the financial crimes and the harm done to Wren were separate matters, that there wasn't yet a direct enough link between the commissioner and what had happened to my stepdaughter specifically. He won't get that deal, I said. Dorian, without direct evidence tying him to the order. He won't get that deal, I said again, because I taught that girl everything I know about keeping records the year before her wedding. If she was ever in a situation where someone had power over her and she couldn't get out, I told her exactly what to do. Document everything. And if it ever got dangerous, always keep the recording running. There was a long pause on Percival's end of the line. You think she did? I looked up at the hospital windows, at the 3rd floor, 3rd window from the left, where Wren had been slowly finding her way back to herself for weeks. I think. I said, she is her mother's daughter and mine both. And I think some part of her knew this was coming long before any of us did. 2 days later, a nurse met me at the 2nd floor station with tears standing in her eyes before she even said a word. Mr. Ashworth, she said. She's awake. She's been asking for you. If this story has moved you even half as much as living through it moved me, I need you to do something before we finish this journey together. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that quiet strength, patience, and refusing to look away can still bring even the most powerful people to their knees. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Dorian's Revenge Stories, because our final chapter, the one where Ren finally speaks, where the truth she'd been hiding under her own pillow for weeks comes to light, and where a courtroom finally closes the book on the Voss family is next. Her eyes found me the second I came through the door, and they did not let go. "Dad," she said one word, rough from weeks of disuse, but unmistakably hers. I crossed the room in 4 steps and sat carefully on the edge of the bed, mindful of the IV line and the bandages still wrapped around her arm, and I put my arms around my daughter and held on. We stayed like that for a long time. When we finally separated, she reached beneath her pillow with a movement so deliberate, it was obvious she'd rehearsed it in her mind many times before her hands were strong enough to do it, and drew out a small, cracked screen phone. "The night it happened," she said, "I heard them on the phone downstairs before Callan came upstairs. I remembered what you told me before the wedding. Document everything. If it's ever dangerous, keep the recording running." Her chin trembled, but her voice held. So I went to the kitchen. I set the phone face down on the counter. I pressed record, and then I went back upstairs and waited. I opened the file with shaking hands. The audio was imperfect, muffled by fabric, but the words were unmistakable. Godric Voss's voice, coming through a phone speaker, calm and certain of being obeyed. "Handle it tonight. I've already spoken to the department. No one's going to ask questions we don't want asked." And Callan's voice, flat, compliant. "I understand." It was the same command Solveig had captured from inside the house. But this recording came from the room itself, time-stamped the exact night Ren was admitted, in her own voice narrating the moment she pressed record. There was no argument left for Godric's attorneys to build. No distance between the commissioner and what had happened to my daughter. His own voice had closed the last door he thought was still open. I called Percival from the hallway. "Tell Agent Okonkwo Reyes the proffer is finished," I said. "We have his voice giving the direct order." "Good," Percival said quietly. "Dorian, that's very good." 14 months later, on a flat white February morning, I sat in a federal courtroom in a suit I hadn't worn since Mina's funeral, with Ren beside me in a dark blue coat, her hands folded, her hair down, her face fully healed, no trace left of the bruising, no evidence of the stitches, just her face, the one that looked like her mother around the eyes. Judge Adaise Whitcomb took the bench at 9-3, with the particular stillness of someone who has sat at the center of difficult rooms for a long time, and understands that stillness is its own form of authority. One by one, the pleas were entered. Callan first, thinner than I remembered, his voice flat and compliant to the very end. Beatrix second, composed, showing nothing, which told me more about her than tears ever could have. And Godric last, walking to the defense table with the careful dignity of a man who has decided appearance is the only thing left he can control, and watching, in real time, as a federal courtroom refused to defer to him the way his own county always had. When Judge Whitcomb read the final charge, conspiracy to tamper with a witness, the legal box the system had found to hold what had been done to my daughter, there was a pause of perhaps 3 seconds before Godric answered. I counted every one of them. "Yes," he said. I did not make a sound. I sat with my hands folded on a legal pad in my lap and breathed slowly while the machinery of justice finished its work around me. Ren reached over and put her hand on mine. Behind us, I heard Detective Fenwick exhale, long and low, the sound, I think, of a man finally setting down something he'd carried for 19 years. A year later, on a July evening when the heat had finally broken and the air through my kitchen screen door smelled like cut grass, I sat on my porch and did nothing at all, which, for a man who has spent his whole life auditing grocery lists out of habit, was its own kind of victory. Ren sat beside me with a paperback in her lap. Percival had driven up that afternoon with tomatoes from his garden. Adeline had texted the week before, promoted. Senior compliance analyst. Thought you should know. Doctor. Ondera had come for dinner and stayed until 11. Funnier than I ever expected a woman who delivers hard news for a living to be. Solveig had written from her new life 2 counties over, A photograph of a cardinal on a snowy fence post tucked inside the card. I'd put it on my refrigerator, right beside a photo of Mina laughing in an April wind. I went inside and came back with the last legal pad from the box above my refrigerator, opened it to the first page, and looked at the single word written there in my own hand from the morning this all began. Voss. I drew one straight, unhurried line through it. The line of a man closing an account that has finally, fully been settled. Dorothy Mina, I said quietly to the oak tree in the yard, correcting myself the way I still sometimes do. The books are balanced. I thought you should know. My name is Dorian Ashworth, and this is the story I never wanted to have. If someone you love is quietly suffering behind a smile that doesn't quite reach their eyes, please don't wait the way I nearly did. Sometimes the system belongs to the wrong people, and sometimes the only person who can act is you, quietly, carefully, with everything you have. If this story moves something in you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what part stayed with you longest. Share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet strength still wins. And subscribe to Dorian's Revenge Stories. We tell stories like this one every single week, and I'll be right here waiting for you in the next one.